York doesn't feel like a place that can disappear. It feels too big, too alive, too solid. But if a nuclear bomb detonated over the city, everything would begin to change in less than a second. Before you hear anything, a flash of light would already hit your eyes, brighter than the sun, carrying enough energy to burn surfaces instantly. Within seconds, an intense wave of heat would spread outward, igniting materials across entire blocks. Then comes the shock wave, a wall of compressed air moving faster than you can react, tearing through streets, shattering buildings, throwing everything in its path. In under a minute, large parts of the city would no longer function as a city at all. And what's left wouldn't just be destruction. It would be something far more dangerous. Because even after the explosion ends, the effects don't stop. When people imagine a nuclear explosion, they think of a massive blast, a deafening sound, a wave of destruction tearing through the city. But that is not how it begins. The first thing that reaches you is not the explosion. It is light, and it arrives faster than your brain can even register what is happening. One moment. New York looks exactly as it always does. Crowded streets, glass towers reflecting the sky, movement everywhere. The next moment, the entire scene is overwhelmed by a flash so intense it doesn't feel like light anymore. It feels like reality itself has been replaced. This flash is not just brightness in the ordinary sense. It is a sudden release of energy so large that for an instant it outshines everything you have ever seen. Shadows are burned into surfaces. Reflections multiply across windows and metal. Every direction becomes the source of light at once. And because light travels faster than anything else produced by the explosion, it reaches you before the heat, before the pressure, before the sound. By the time you are aware that something is wrong, the process has already begun. What makes this moment so dangerous is not just how bright it is, but what that light carries with it. This is not harmless illumination. It is energy moving at the speed of light, spreading outward in all directions. Surfaces facing the detonation begin absorbing that energy immediately. Materials react differently depending on what they are made of, but none of them are prepared for this kind of input. Glass can crack or shatter. Dark surfaces heat up faster than lighter ones. Thin materials respond almost instantly, while thicker structures take slightly longer. But the key point is that the interaction starts everywhere at once, and this happens before you hear anything. Sound takes time to travel. The shock wave that people associate with explosions is still forming, still expanding, still on its way. In that gap, those few fractions of a second, the city is already being altered. It is a strange and unsettling idea that the most destructive event begins in silence. No warning, no build-up, just an overwhelming flash that arrives without permission. Human perception is not designed for something like this. Your eyes react, but too slowly. Your brain tries to interpret the signal, but there is nothing familiar to compare it to. It does not feel like looking at a bright light source. It feels like being inside the light itself. And because this happens so quickly, there is no time to process, no time to move, no time to understand. The cause and the effect collapse into a single moment. Across the city, millions of separate viewpoints experience the same event from different distances. But the sequence is always the same. First the flash, then everything else. People closer to the center experience it with overwhelming intensity, while those farther away still see something impossible. A sudden transformation of the sky and the environment that makes no sense in everyday terms. But the physics does not pause for interpretation. The energy continues to move outward, interacting with everything it touches. This is what makes a nuclear detonation fundamentally different from what most people imagine. It does not start as a blast that you hear and react to. It starts as a transfer of energy that happens before reaction is even possible. The city is not given a moment to respond. There is no gradual escalation. There is only an instant where the normal rules of experience break, and a new set of conditions takes over. And by the time the sound finally begins to arrive, by the time the shock wave starts to follow the path the light has already traced, the outcome is already unfolding. Because the first phase of destruction did not wait for the explosion to be heard. It began the moment the light reached the city. After the flash, before the shock wave arrives, something even more dangerous is already moving through the city. And most people would never see it coming, because it is not something you can see clearly or hear. It is heat carried outward as an intense burst of thermal radiation, spreading at the speed of light, reaching buildings, streets, and people almost instantly after the initial flash. And what makes it terrifying is that it does not behave like the kind of heat you are used to. It does not slowly warm the air or give you time to react. It delivers energy so quickly that surfaces begin to change before your mind can process what is happening. This wave of heat moves invisibly across blocks of the city. And the moment it reaches a surface, that surface begins to absorb energy. Materials that normally feel stable and solid suddenly react in ways that seem unnatural. Dark surfaces absorb more energy and heat up faster, while reflective materials can redirect part of that energy, but nothing is truly safe. Glass, metal, concrete, fabric, everything begins interacting with this incoming energy at once. And the key detail is timing, because this is happening in fractions of a second, long before any blast or sound arrives to warn you. In a dense city like New York, this effect multiplies, because every surface becomes part of the interaction. Sunlight normally reflects softly between buildings, but this is not sunlight. This is a concentrated pulse of energy, bouncing, reflecting, and being absorbed across thousands of surfaces at the same time, meaning that even areas not directly facing the explosion are still affected. The geometry of the city itself helps spread the heat further, deeper into streets and between structures, turning the entire environment into a network that distributes energy rather than blocking it. What makes this phase especially dangerous is that it feels disconnected from the idea of an explosion. There is no immediate force pushing you, no sound to signal danger, just a sudden and overwhelming transfer of energy into everything around you. Materials begin to heat unevenly. Tensions build inside structures as different parts expand at different rates. Windows can fail, surfaces can warp, and anything that can ignite becomes vulnerable almost instantly. But all of this happens quietly, almost invisibly, before the violent part people expect has even begun. The human body is also part of this interaction, because it too absorbs energy. And unlike materials designed to handle heat, it has very little protection against such an intense and sudden input. And the most unsettling part is that there is no gradual warning. It does not feel like standing near a fire where heat builds over time. It is more like stepping into a condition that is already extreme, where the energy has already arrived and the process has already started. Across the city, this creates a strange moment where everything is changing at once, but nothing has yet been physically thrown or shattered by force. It is a phase of silent damage, where the environment is being primed for what comes next. Because once materials are weakened, heated, or ignited, they become far more vulnerable to the shock wave that is still on its way. Meaning that this invisible wave is not just destructive on its own. It also prepares the city to be destroyed more easily by the forces that follow. And this is why the heat phase is so important to understand, because it completely changes the sequence people imagine. The explosion does not begin with impact. It begins with energy, and that energy spreads faster than anything else, reaching out across the city, altering surfaces, starting fires, and weakening structures before the air itself begins to move. So by the time the shock wave finally arrives, it is not hitting the same city that existed seconds before. It is hitting a city that has already been changed, already been heated, and already been pushed closer to collapse. After the flash and the heat, the center of the explosion becomes something far more extreme, something that no longer behaves like anything in everyday experience. This is the fireball. And calling it a ball of fire is almost misleading, because what is happening inside that region is not just burning. It is a rapid transformation of matter under conditions so intense that the normal rules you are used to begin to break down. At the very center, energy has been released in such a concentrated way that the surrounding air does not simply heat up. It is driven into a state where temperature and pressure rise so quickly that the air itself expands violently outward. And in that moment, the boundary between what is air and what is energy begins to blur, because everything inside that region is being pushed beyond its usual limits. Molecules are no longer just vibrating faster. They are being forced apart. Interactions that normally hold matter together are overwhelmed by the sheer amount of energy present. This is why the fireball grows so rapidly. It is not just flames spreading outward like in a normal fire. It is a region where energy is forcing space itself to make room, pushing air away, creating a sphere that expands in all directions. And as it grows, it continues to transfer energy into the surrounding environment, feeding into the processes you have already seen: the heat, the pressure, and the destruction that follows. In a dense city like New York, this effect becomes even more striking, because the fireball is not forming in an empty field. It is forming in the middle of structures, streets, and materials that are suddenly exposed to conditions they were never designed to withstand. Surfaces close to the center are not simply damaged. They are overwhelmed, because the intensity of the environment exceeds the thresholds that define normal physical behavior. Meaning that what happens there is not gradual failure. It is immediate transformation. And what makes this moment so difficult to fully grasp is how quickly it unfolds. The fireball does not slowly build over time. It appears and expands in a fraction of a second, meaning that by the time you are aware of it, it has already reached a size large enough to dominate its surroundings. And everything within that region has already been subjected to extreme conditions. There is no clear boundary where things are safe and then suddenly not. Instead, there is a gradient of intensity that drops off with distance, but near the center. That intensity is so high that the distinction between different materials becomes less meaningful, because all of them are being pushed toward the same outcome. From a physics perspective, the fireball represents a moment where energy density becomes the dominant factor. Not structure, not design, not engineering. Everything that defines a city, the materials, the shapes, the organization, is temporarily irrelevant compared to the amount of energy being released in that small volume of space. And this is what makes nuclear detonations fundamentally different from conventional explosions. Because the scale of energy involved is not just larger, it is concentrated in a way that changes how matter responds. As the fireball expands, it also sets the stage for the next phase, because the rapid outward motion of hot gases creates the pressure differences that will drive the shock wave. Meaning that what you are seeing is not an isolated phenomenon, it is part of a chain of events. The energy released at the center is continuously being converted into motion, heat, and force. And each of those will interact with the city in different ways as time progresses. But in this moment, at the heart of the event, the fireball is the clearest expression of what has happened. It is the visible result of an enormous amount of energy being released in an extremely short time, creating conditions where matter no longer behaves in familiar ways, and where the idea of a stable environment, something that can resist or endure, no longer applies. Because everything inside that region has already crossed a threshold beyond which normal behavior cannot continue. After the light and the heat and the rapid expansion of the fireball, the next phase arrives. And this is the moment most people think of when they imagine an explosion. But by the time it reaches you, the city has already begun to change. Because now the air itself becomes the main force of destruction, not as something gentle or invisible, but as a moving wall of pressure that carries enormous energy across the streets of New York. The shock wave is created because the fireball expands so quickly that it pushes the surrounding air outward, compressing it into a dense, high-pressure front. And that front moves faster than anything you can react to, sweeping through avenues, around corners, between buildings, and unlike wind, which flows around obstacles, this is more like a sudden impact that hits everything at once. A rapid spike in pressure followed by a violent drop. And that change alone is enough to break structures that were never designed to handle such forces. What makes this especially destructive in a city like New York is the density of the environment, because the shock wave does not simply pass through open space. It interacts with buildings, reflecting off surfaces, bouncing between structures, amplifying in narrow streets, and creating complex patterns of pressure that can be even more damaging than the initial wave itself. Meaning that some areas experience not just one impact, but multiple overlapping pulses as the energy continues to move and reflect through the city. Windows are often the first visible failure, not because they are weak, but because they respond quickly to pressure differences. They shatter almost instantly, sending fragments outward at high speed. And once the outer layer of a building is compromised, the pressure can enter inside, pushing against walls, floors, and internal structures, turning the inside of buildings into environments where force is applied from multiple directions at once, something most designs are not meant to withstand. Vehicles on the streets are lifted, pushed, or overturned, depending on their position and the direction of the wave. Debris becomes airborne, and everything that is not firmly anchored begins to move. Not gradually, but suddenly, because the shock wave does not give time for adjustment. It is an abrupt transfer of momentum, where objects go from stillness to motion almost instantly. And that sudden change is what causes so much of the damage. And again, timing is critical, because the shock wave follows the path that the light and heat have already prepared. Surfaces have been heated. Materials may already be weakened. Small fires may have already started. So when the pressure wave arrives, it is not striking a stable city. It is striking one that has already been altered, already made more vulnerable, which increases the overall effect of the impact. In open areas, the wave can spread more evenly, but in dense urban grids, it becomes more unpredictable. Pressure builds and releases in confined spaces. Corners become points where energy concentrates, and long, straight streets can channel the wave, allowing it to travel further with more force, creating zones of destruction that extend beyond what you might expect if you imagined the explosion in an empty field. The human experience of this moment is completely different from the heat phase, because now there is force, movement, and sound. The delayed roar of the explosion finally arrives, accompanied by the physical sensation of being pushed, struck, or thrown. And it happens almost simultaneously with the visual confirmation of destruction. Buildings failing, debris moving, the environment shifting in a way that leaves no doubt that something massive has occurred. And this is why the shock wave is often remembered as the defining feature of an explosion, because it is the moment where energy becomes motion, where invisible processes become physical impact, where the city is no longer just being altered, but actively torn apart by the air itself. And the idea that something as ordinary as the atmosphere can become a destructive force on this scale is what makes this phase so unsettling, because it means that the very medium we live in, the air around us, has been turned into a weapon. By the time the shock wave has passed, the destruction is no longer just about individual buildings or isolated damage. It becomes something much larger and more complex, because a city like New York is not just a collection of structures. It is a tightly connected system. And when enough parts of that system are disrupted at once, the entire thing begins to fail in ways that are far more severe than the sum of the initial impact. In everyday life, the strength of a city comes from how everything is connected. Electricity powers transportation. Transportation moves people. People operate services. Services maintain infrastructure. And all of it depends on a continuous flow of energy, information, and coordination. But this same interdependence is also a weakness, because when multiple critical points are hit at the same time, the system does not degrade slowly. It collapses rapidly. Power is one of the first elements affected, because electrical grids rely on a balance between supply and demand. And when major sections are suddenly destroyed or disconnected, that balance breaks. Transformers fail. Lines go down. And large portions of the city lose electricity almost instantly, and without power. Communication systems begin to fail as well. Signals drop. Networks become unreliable. And the ability to coordinate any kind of response is reduced just when it is needed the most. Transportation quickly follows. Streets are blocked by debris. Intersections become unusable. And the underground systems that normally move millions of people, such as subways and tunnels, are no longer functioning as intended. Some may be physically damaged. Others may be inaccessible. And without power or communication, even intact parts of the system become difficult to operate, turning what was once an efficient network into a fragmented and unpredictable environment. Emergency services, which are designed to respond to localized incidents, face a completely different challenge in this situation, because the scale of disruption is citywide. Resources are overwhelmed, access routes are limited, and coordination becomes extremely difficult. meaning that even though the systems are still there in principle, their ability to function effectively is severely reduced, not because they are poorly designed, but because they were never meant to handle simultaneous failures across so many interconnected components. What makes this phase particularly important is that it marks the transition from immediate physical destruction to systemic breakdown. The initial forces of light, heat, and pressure have already done their work. But now the consequences continue to unfold through the structure of the city itself. Failures propagate from one system to another. Small disruptions combine into larger ones, and the overall effect becomes more complex and harder to predict. In a dense urban environment, this propagation happens faster because everything is closer together, more tightly linked, and more dependent on shared infrastructure, meaning that a failure in one area can quickly influence another, creating a chain reaction that spreads through the city, not as a wave of force, but as a wave of dysfunction, where systems that normally operate smoothly begin to interfere with each other or stop working altogether. And from the perspective of someone experiencing it, this phase feels very different from the initial explosion, because instead of a single overwhelming event, it is a series of realizations that the systems you rely on are no longer functioning. Lights do not turn on. Signals do not connect. Transportation does not move. And the city that once felt organized and predictable becomes fragmented and uncertain. This is why a dense city does not just get damaged. It undergoes a transformation in how it operates. The very features that make it efficient and powerful in normal conditions become sources of vulnerability when disrupted. And the result is not just destruction in the physical sense, but a collapse in the underlying systems that allow the city to exist as a functioning whole, turning a complex, coordinated environment into one that struggles to maintain even its most basic operations. After the shock wave has passed and the systems of the city begin to fail, a new phase emerges, one that does not arrive as a single event but grows out of everything that has already happened. And this is where the destruction stops being a moment and becomes a process. Because across the city, countless small fires that started during the heat phase begin to spread, connect, and intensify, turning isolated damage into something far more self-sustaining and difficult to control. At first, these fires seem separate. A building here, a street there, scattered points of ignition caused by intense heat interacting with materials throughout the city. But in a dense environment like New York, separation does not last long because buildings are close together. Materials are abundant, and the conditions created by the explosion have already weakened structures and exposed new fuel sources, meaning that these fires do not remain isolated. They begin to merge. As multiple fires grow, they start to influence the air around them. Hot air rises rapidly, creating upward currents that pull in cooler air from the surroundings. And this movement of air feeds the flames, providing more oxygen and allowing them to burn more intensely. And when enough fires are burning close to each other, this effect scales up. The rising heat becomes stronger. The inflow of air becomes faster. And what was once a collection of fires begins to behave like a massive system. This is the point where a firestorm can form. Not just a large fire, but a self-reinforcing cycle where heat creates airflow, and airflow feeds more heat. And in a city filled with combustible materials, from interiors to vehicles to infrastructure components, this cycle can sustain itself. drawing in oxygen from surrounding areas and pushing hot gases upward in a continuous flow, creating conditions that are far more extreme than typical urban fires. What makes this especially dangerous is that the environment itself begins to contribute to the process. Streets channel airflow. Gaps between buildings act like pathways for moving air. And the density of structures provides both fuel and confinement, allowing heat to build and circulate in ways that are difficult to predict or control. And because emergency systems have already been disrupted, there is little to interrupt this progression once it reaches a certain scale. From a physical perspective, the firestorm represents a shift from externally driven destruction to internally sustained destruction. The initial explosion provided the energy to start the fires, but now the system feeds itself. The energy released by burning materials continues to drive airflow, and that airflow continues to support combustion, creating a loop that can persist over time as long as fuel and oxygen remain available. For someone within the city, this phase feels very different from the earlier moments. There is no single point of impact, no clear beginning or end. Instead, there is a spreading environment of heat, smoke, and movement, where conditions can change rapidly depending on location, and where the direction of airflow can influence how the fire behaves, making it difficult to find stable or predictable condition. The scale of this process also matters, because as more areas become involved, the overall system becomes stronger. Larger fires generate stronger airflow, which can pull in air from greater distances, extending the reach of the firestorm and drawing more parts of the city into the process. And this expansion is not driven by a new explosion, but by the continuation of the one that has already occurred. Its effects unfolding over time. And this is why this phase is so important to understand, because it shows that the destruction does not end when the initial forces pass. It evolves, it reorganizes, and it continues. The city is no longer just reacting to an external event. It has become part of a system that is generating its own destructive conditions, where heat, air, and fuel interact in a way that sustains the damage far beyond the first moments of the detonation, turning what began as a sudden event into an ongoing transformation of the environment itself. After the light, the heat, the shock wave, and the fires, it might seem like the worst is over, because the most visible and violent parts of the event have already passed. But this is where the nature of a nuclear detonation becomes even more unsettling, because the next phase is not something you can clearly see or hear, and yet it can continue to affect the city long after the explosion itself has ended. This is fallout, and it transforms the environment in a way that is far less obvious but far more persistent. Fallout begins with the material that has been lifted into the air during the explosion: dust, debris, particles from buildings, icaded soil, and other matter that has been pulled upward by the rising column of hot air created by the fireball and the fires that followed. And as this material rises, it can become mixed with radioactive substances produced during the detonation, forming particles that are carried by the wind and eventually begin to settle back down over the surrounding area. What makes this phase difficult to grasp is that it does not arrive as a single moment. There is no clear boundary where you can say it has begun in the same way you could with the flash or the shock wave. Instead, it unfolds over time as particles gradually fall back to the ground, landing on surfaces across the city, on streets, rooftops, vehicles, and anything exposed to the open air. And because this process depends on atmospheric conditions, the exact pattern of where these particles go can vary, spreading the effects beyond the immediate area of the explosion. Unlike the earlier phases, which are intense but brief, fallout represents a shift toward duration. It lingers, it accumulates, and it interacts with the environment in ways that are not immediately visible. And this is what makes it so challenging, because the absence of clear sensory signals can create the impression that conditions have stabilized, even though significant changes are still taking place at a level that cannot be easily perceived. From a physical standpoint, the key idea is that the explosion has redistributed material, lifting it into the atmosphere and then allowing it to return in a different form. And this redistribution extends the reach of the event, both in space and in time, because the effects are no longer confined to the moment of detonation or the immediate area. They continue as long as particles remain in motion and continue to settle. In a city environment, this has additional implications because surfaces are complex and varied. Some materials can trap or hold particles more easily. Others may allow them to be moved again by wind or activity, meaning that the environment does not simply receive fallout once and remain unchanged. It can continue to shift as particles are redistributed, resuspended, or concentrated in different locations. For people experiencing this phase, the challenge is not a sudden force or visible threat, but uncertainty, because the conditions are no longer defined by immediate events, but by ongoing processes. And understanding those processes requires information that may not be readily available, especially in a situation where communication systems have already been disrupted, making it harder to assess where it is safe and where it is not. And this is what makes fallout fundamentally different from the earlier stages. It is not about the initial release of energy, but about what happens after that energy has already reshaped the environment. It is the continuation of the event in a quieter but more persistent form, extending the impact beyond the moment of the explosion and into the time that follows. So while the flash fades, the fires burn down, and the immediate motion of the shock wave dissipates, the effects of the detonation do not simply end. They transition into something less visible but still significant, a phase where the city is no longer just dealing with what has happened, but with what continues to happen, even when there is nothing obvious left to see.